This is a presentation on Hannah Arendt and Heidegger, and we're really familiar with Heidegger at this point in the quarter. We're aware of his association with the Nazi Party. That time period in his life, he joined the party in 1933, and though he only took part in meetings for about a year, he did remain in a rather inactive role and still aligned himself for a number of years, which got him banned from teaching for a period of time as well. And this time period in his life is one which he would later claim to be ashamed of, but that time period is something that unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you personally view this situation and him, comes kind of as, defining his identity in the world of philosophy in a lot of ways, and not just for those looking at his life in hindsight, but for the relationships in his life at the time. There tended to be a lot of confusion surrounding his decisions and actions. Many of his personal relationships became strained during this time, and one of those relationships we'll examine today is one of the more, if not his most controversial, that relationship being with Jewish scholar and political thinker Hannah Arendt. I'm not going to call her a philosopher because from what I understand, she did not consider herself one, and kind of warned against philosophy and renounced that title as much as she could, although it's still labeled as such in many texts for her. And they had a complicated relationship over the years, and obviously they differed in personal identity, but that's just sort of the surface of the controversy of their relationship. They definitely had an influence on each other, and some say this influence was completely one-sided. Heidegger influencing Arendt, he was her teacher, and the older of the two, and obviously the man. But the close nature of their relationship points to the fact that she might have had an influence on him as well. But to fully understand the relationship, we first need to get acquainted with Hannah, because we only are really schooled in Heidegger, most of us at this point. So, quick overview of her life here. We're going to delve deeper into a few of these points later on. Arendt was born in 1906 in Hanover, Germany. As I said previously, Arendt was Jewish, but she wasn't necessarily raised to be hyper-aware of that identity. Her father died when she was very young, and her mother wasn't particularly religious, didn't really stress that part of their life to Hannah growing up. But at age 18 in 1924, Arendt entered the University of Marburg as a student, where she attended the lectures of Heidegger, and it's during these lectures that he first noticed her, and they began their personal correspondence. She did not stay in Marburg. Her and Heidegger's in-person relations were rather brief, as she ended up at the University of Freiburg in 1926 to study and work with Karl Jaspers, who was a philosopher that became a sort of mentor and father figure to her, and they remained close their entire lives. Then in 1933, she was arrested for illegal anti-Nazi research, but she did manage to escape and flee to Paris. She had a lot of good luck during this time period. And it was around this time that she and Heidegger actually ceased their correspondence. Just a reminder that this is around the same moment he was accepting the rectorship at the University of Freiburg and aligned himself with the Nazi Party. So Arendt and Heidegger would not speak again for 17 years following this time period. And then in 1941, she and her husband, who was a pretty liberal man who worked with a lot of liberal leftist theater folk, they moved to New York City, and that's where she would stay for pretty much the rest of her life. And then I'm just going to give an overview of some of her most or more notable works. So in 1951, The Origins of Totalitarianism, 1958, The Human Condition, She wrote Eichmann in Jerusalem, Reports on the Banality of Evil in 1963. Men in Dark Times was 1968. On Violence, and then Crises of the Republic. She wrote many, many works. These are just a few, but they are kind of her most well-known, I guess, if you're getting to know her. And all of these works, like I said, are noteworthy. But the one that she's been deemed as a controversial figure herself for better or for worse, and the one that I will touch on a little deeper today, is going to be her report on the Eichmann trial, which most people just reference as the banality of evil. And just to review so we can kind of understand the controversy here. So in 1961, Arendt was invited by The New Yorker to attend the hearings of Adolf Eichmann, who, if you aren't familiar, he was a high-ranking SS officer who was put on trial, a very public trial in Israel, for the crimes he committed during the war. People kind of called him a desk man in the sense that he wasn't really out in the field killing anyone personally, but he was responsible for and very active in the coordination of mass extermination, the final solution as we know it. And he really, he was a desk man, but he went out of his way to exterminate as many people as possible. Just a big point of contention was that towards the end of the war in Hungary, he was actually not given orders to continue organizing extermination trips to Auschwitz, and he continued to do so. And, by July of 1944, there were something like over 400,000 of Hungary's 700,000 Jewish population who had died. So Eichmann personally made arrangements for a lot of this. Obviously not all of it, but he was a big player. So his trial was used as a sort of platform for survivors to speak out and for the public to have a larger role in the unfoldings of a trial. It was kind of like a catharsis in a way. And Eichmann was executed in 1962 following the conclusion of the trial. But the trial was in the global spotlight while it ran, and Arendt attended this trial and published reports and further commentary titled, of course, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. This text was incredibly controversial. Many people among the US and Jewish populations called Hannah an anti-Jew, a hypocrite, insensitive, all kinds of just really negative feedback that she got from this. And she even contemplated leaving the States because she just felt incredibly isolated and despised. And, you would imagine that this Jewish woman writing about this trial, I think people were expecting one thing and got a completely other thing. And so I'm just going to let this text kind of speak for itself so we can understand what she's really getting at with this. For when I speak of the banality of evil, I do so only on the strictly factual level, pointing to a phenomenon which stared one in the face at the trial. Eichmann was not Iago and not Macbeth, and nothing would have been farther from his mind than to determine with Richard III to prove a villain. Except for an extraordinary diligence in looking out for his personal advancement, he had no motives at all. He merely, to put the matter colloquially, never realized what he was doing. It was sheer thoughtlessness, something by no means identical with stupidity, that predisposed him to become one of the greatest criminals of that period. And if this is banal and even funny, if with the best will in the world one cannot extract any diabolical or demonic profundity from Eichmann, this is still far from calling it commonplace. That such remoteness from reality and such thoughtlessness can wreak more havoc than all the evil instincts taken together which, perhaps, are inherent in man. That was, in fact, the lesson one could learn in Jerusalem. So I think this passage really summarizes for us not only what made her text so controversial, but also makes clear maybe to us the influence of Heidegger's philosophy. Here she's saying, to those who wanted Eichmann to stand in as a sort of singular symbol for all the horrible acts that took place during the war, how they interpreted her text as saying, no, it's not his fault. It's not this one man. Evil doesn't live in this one person. And that's why many people were calling her insensitive, and they kind of called out her what they perceived as detachment from the situation. And here's another passage that might kind of help us further. And this is probably one of the most cited quotes in her work. Good can be radical, evil can never be radical. It can only be extreme, for it possesses neither depth nor any demonic dimension, yet, and this is its horror, it can spread like a fungus over the surface of the earth and lay waste to the entire world. Evil comes from a failure to think. So yeah, she's kind of, the intention, I think, was the big point that people were angry about. She was, in their minds, denying the intent of Eichmann and saying he was just kind of, a desk man in a lot of ways, and that made people angry. But I think in these passages we get a sense of her perspective on the world, and also what made her controversial but also a great thinker. And I thought it was important to visit her and her mind first before we dive into the relationship with Heidegger, because it is really important to understand that she's no angel in terms of her reputation. That's not the controversy between Heidegger and Arendt. Instead, we have two controversial figures whose relationship helped to shape each other's theories in a lot of ways, and his influence is evident on the prior quotes that I've shown here. But I think now we can move on to their relationship. So as we saw in the overview of Hannah's life, she and Heidegger met when she was attending his lectures at the University of Marburg in 1924. Heidegger was 35 and she was just 18. Heidegger was married, and by the way, his wife, Elfriede, was incredibly anti-Semitic, and he had other affairs, other women at this time, so Hannah and he were no means exclusive in any regard. Also keep in mind that at this point he was well established, but not nearly as well established as we know him today. He was kind of just a teacher that people were looking at as kind of an up-and-coming guy. But Hannah and Martin Heidegger had a very strong connection and a very passionate correspondence that people often reference. And I will just go ahead. This is taken from a documentary about Arendt's life made in 2013 called Vita Activa, and this is some of the correspondence from their first meetings. I will just play here.
February 1925. Dear Miss Arendt, everything should be simple and clear and pure between us. Only then will we be worthy of having been allowed to meet. You are my pupil and I your teacher, but that is only the circumstances of what's happened to us. I will never be able to call you mine, but from now on you will belong in my life. You have lost your disquiet, which means you have found your way to the innermost, purest feminine essence. Someday you will be grateful, not to me, that this visit to my office hour was your decisive retreat from the path of academic research, which only men can endure. We must not think of ourselves as soulmates, something no one ever experiences. I cannot and do not want to separate your loyal eyes and beautiful figure from your pure trust, the honor and goodness of your girlish essence. Yours, Martin.
(1925). Every time I woke up from the long, dreamy, and yet deep sleep in which one merges entirely with what one dreams, I felt the same shy, caring, probing tenderness towards the things of the world. This made clear to me how much of my actual life had sunken completely into itself, like sleep. Indeed, when the simplicity and ordinariness of life struck me to the core, it did not occur to me that all the suffering I experienced would be so banal, a worthless nothing that everybody just took for granted.
April 1925. Tottenauberg. My dearest, fragmentation and despair will never overpower your supportive love for my work. Your letter moved me for days. The parts, if you want to have me, if you like. What can I do in the face of such shy and yet so resolute waiting? Such persistence. Good night, dearest Hannah. Your Martin.
So yeah, pretty intense. It was an intense time for them both, and this time period kind of binded them together. And they continued to write to each other until, as we have noted before, Arendt fled to Paris. And while Heidegger never said anything directly to her, denigrating her or her Jewish identity, she was aware of how he treated others, especially his close friends. If you remember from the slide about her early life, I talked about Karl Jaspers, her kind of father figure, main mentor. Well, Heidegger definitely personally insulted him when he refused to acknowledge Jasper's wife or greet her at their meeting when she was, there in attendance, and he had greeted her many times before. But Jasper's wife was Jewish, and Jaspers took this very personally, and he must have disclosed this to Arendt. I didn't actually find that evidence, but it could be one of the many, many reasons why Arendt and Heidegger did not continue their correspondence during this time. The next time they would be in contact would come in 1949. By this time, Arendt had become a successful theorist and published author, and as we know, Heidegger, he had previously renounced his alliance with the support of the Nazi Party, but had been kind of put through the ringer, so to speak, when it came to the investigation into his life in this time period. And, he had been banned from teaching for a period, and they did remain after this in contact, and it was a slow build of the relationship, and Arendt really struggled with her feelings over this time period in his life herself, and it kind of goes back and forth, but she ends up pretty much critical of him, but also forgiving. In 1953, she wrote something that people reference a lot about him that kind of points to her wrestling with his identity and his handling of the time period that was so controversial. She says, Heidegger says proudly, people say Heidegger is a fox. This is the true story of Heidegger the Fox. There was once a fox so utterly without cunning that he not only constantly fell into traps, but could not even distinguish a trap from a non-trap. So very Heidegger language there. And also, kind of similar to Eichmann, she's kind of taking away the personal intent and saying there's a plurality there, basically. And that's kind of something she stresses in a lot of her work, from what I understand, the plurality, which obviously big Heidegger influence there. Later on, she would write about forgiveness, in specifically her text, The Human Condition. And if you kind of place Heidegger's name before this quotation and think about him, just read him into this quote, you can kind of see how she might have come to wrestle with the situation. She says, forgiving and the relationship it establishes is always an eminently personal, though not necessarily individual or private, affair, in which what was done is forgiven for the sake of who did it. For love, although it is one of the rarest occurrences in human lives, is unconcerned to the point of total unworldliness with what the loved person may be, with his qualities and shortcomings, achievements, failings, and transgressions. So again, we're getting this plurality, she's not wanting to fix a singular type of blame or guilt onto an individual. She doesn't find that useful. And later in their lives, towards the end, they did become very, very close again. They were writing often, and on Heidegger's 80th birthday, Arendt gave a talk, radio talk, where she kind of recalled his lectures on Plato and other subjects, and she spoke very highly of his teaching. She spoke very highly of his passion for the subject, and she also, in this talk, did remark on what she calls his mistake, his escapade of sorts. And she did state that he recognized the mistake, and he did take a risk by going back on this mistake and admitting this mistake. And she sent a copy of this radio talk to him, and she kind of attached a little note at the end, and I'll just end on this note reading that. May those who come after us, when they recall our century and its people, and try to keep faith with them, not forget the devastating sandstorms that swept us up, each in his own way, and in which something like this man and his work were still possible. Arendt died just a few months before Heidegger. She died at age 69 in December of 1975, and he would die the following year in May.